Oops. Okay, so we are looking at part 5, cellular respiration. Remember, cellular respiration is a process in which cells are able to gain enough oxygen to survive. Uh, so we went over photosynthesis. This is covering the half of all living species on Earth, which would be anything that does photosynthesis. Mostly, these would be bacteria and plants, mostly as in all. Now, cellular respiration is everything else that is included. So, of course, part 5 is where we will have, after this one, you'll have a 10-question quiz, and then we will go on to your first unit, or first test. We'll call it a midterm, basically. So, after 5, you'll have a midterm, and then after 10, you'll have your final. Once you have completed those, then you have completed this course. So, cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is a way to harvest chemical energy. So this is the process in which ATP breaks down organic compounds. Respiration begins with a process called glycolysis. So this makes a very small amount of ATP. Remember, ATP is what we use for energy in our blood, in animals, anything that are heterotrophs. It will follow one of two pathways, depending on the cell and depending on if there's oxygen or not. So if oxygen is absent, it will follow anaerobic respiration. This yields no ATP, but it does provide energy to be used. If oxygen is present, it's called aerobic respiration. So anaerobic, no oxygen; aerobic, oxygen. Remember, aerobic, think of doing aerobics. That would be swimming, running, things that you need to breathe a lot to have energy. So aerobic respiration provides a much larger amount of ATP than glycolysis does alone. Glycolysis takes place in the cytosol of the cell. So it takes a molecule of glucose and produces 2 to 3 carbons of pyruvic acid. So here's your steps of glycolysis. So step 1, 2 phosphate groups attach to the glucose, forming a 6-carbon compound. The phosphate is then added by the ATP, which reduces into ADP. So remember, respiration is an oxidation and reduction reaction. So you're going to have oxidation, which is use of oxygen, and reduction, which uses oxygen. Oxidation creates, reduction uses. So the 6-carbon compound formed in one step is split into 2 3-carbon molecules of PGL or PGAL. The 2 PGL molecules are oxidized, and then each group gets a phosphate group. So each gets a phosphate group. The product of this step is a 3-carbon compound that is made by the reduction of 2 NAD plus molecules and 2 NADH molecules. The NAD plus is a compound that accepts electrons, just like the NADP in photosynthesis. So think of these two connected. So respiration and photosynthesis are very close to the same process. It's just that you're going to have different products and different reactants. You are creating energy. You're taking energy to be able to use for one process or the other. Step 4, the phosphate groups that are added during steps 1 and 3 are removed from the 3-carbon compounds formed in step 3. The reaction produces 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Each phosphate group is combined with an ADP, and a total of 4 phosphate groups are added during steps 1 and 3, so your total of 4 ATP. So basically, as we go through it, you are creating 4 ATP to have that energy for respiration. So this process is the introduction into the rest of respiration. So because 2 molecules are used in step 1 and 4 are produced during the process, a net gain of 2 ATP molecules are produced for every molecule of glucose that enters the pathway. So basically, in this process, you have to use half of what you are producing. So what happens to the pyruvic acid depends on if there is oxygen or not. So if there is no oxygen, fermentation happens. So this converts your pyruvic acid into other compounds through additional biochemical pathway in the cytosol. So these do not produce ATP, but they will produce more NAD+. This helps the glycolysis going, and this helps create more ATP. So think about, as we burn these two, we are still creating more of what needs to be done to create that energy. So we're creating more NAD+, which is needed to create more ATP, which is used to help the cell keep on respirating and survive. There are 2 common fermentation pathways. One is lactic acid and one is ethyl alcohol. So lactic acid, you might have heard this if you've ever done any kind of sports or you've been sore. When you're sore, so when you exert yourself, when you run, when you go lift things, if you're sore the next day, that's because there's a buildup of lactic acid that creates this formation in the muscles that causes this pain. So it is a 3-carbon compound, and it is when enzymes convert pyruvic acid into lactic acid. This is done by transferring 2 hydrogen from your NADH and H plus to pyruvic acid. The process is oxidized to form NAD plus, and this is used in the glycolysis. So remember, lactic acid, you're not using oxygen, which is why your muscles get sore, because they need the oxygen in them, but they're producing this to have more glycolysis. This process is felt during stimulus, of course, what we just said. So this is caused by acidity of the lactic acid building up in the muscles. They are transported back to the liver, where it's converted back into pyruvic acid. So remember, your liver is used to filter out things that are not necessarily good for it, and filter out this lactic acid to be able to get rid of the pain in your muscles and wait for more oxygen to become more available. Alcoholic fermentation converts pyruvic acid into ethyl alcohol. This requires 2 different steps. CO2 is removed from the pyruvic acid, leaving 2-carbon compound. So remember, lactic acid is a 3-carbon. Once the CO2 is removed, that makes this a 2-carbon. 2 hydrogen atoms are added, and this compound forms ethyl alcohol. These H atoms, which are hydrogen, come from the NADH and the H+, and they regenerate that NAD+. So this process is the basis for beer and wine. As fermentation proceeds, alcohol buildup in the mixture to the level that is eventually prohibits any more fermentation from continuing. Bread also uses the same thing when it rises. The only difference is the alcohol evaporates during baking. So the anaerobic pathway is not very efficient in transferring energy from glucose to ATP. This pathway evolved from the early history on Earth. Bacteria produced all their ATP through glycolysis. So if you look more at 1 billion years of photosynthesis developed a long time for oxygen to accumulate in the atmosphere, because you're taking these single celled algae and having to take in all this sunlight to be able to create all this oxygen. Oxygen was a byproduct of photosynthesis, and this is why we have a large amount of oxygen in our atmosphere, creating the need for these organisms, or creating the evolution of these organisms to use aerobic respiration. Large organisms cannot have their energy needs satisfied by glycolysis alone. The aerobic pathway is much more efficient than an anaerobic process. So they need a lot. If it is a large organism, or you are a large organism, you need more large amount of ATP to survive. So aerobic respiration is what requires oxygen. So it produces nearly 20 times the amount of glycolysis. The two major cycles are Krebs cycles, or the citric acid cycle, and the electric transport chain. So in prokaryotes, these cycles take place in the cytosol, so just in around your areas, and then eukaryotes, it's the mitochondria, because remember, the mitochondria is your energy, your power plant of the cell. More specifically, this takes place in the matrix, which is the membrane inside of the mitochondria. Krebs cycle, this is a biochemical pathway that breaks down acetal and coenzyme A. It will produce CO2, hydrogen atoms, and ATP. So CO2, it was a byproduct that will be wasted. The reactions that make up the cycle were identified by Hans Krebs, a German-British biochemist. It is a 5-step cycle. So a 2-carbon molecule of acetyl coefficient A, or coenzyme A, combines with 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetic to produce a 6-carbon compound called citric acid. This reaction regenerates the acetyl coenzyme A. Step 2, the citric acid releases a CO2 molecule and a hydrogen atom to form a 5-carbon compound. Remember, if we're releasing CO2, we're getting rid of a carbon. Hydrogen atom is transferred to your NAD+ to create your NADH. Now your 5-carbon compound formed in step 2 releases another CO2 and H, and that will create your 4-carbon compound. And now that is reduced back into your NADH. And a phosphate is added to ADP to create another molecule of ATP. So your 4-carbon now releases 3 hydrogen atom to form another 4-carbon. This time you see you reduce from FAD to FADH because you're getting rid of that hydrogen. It is basically the same as your NAD+. So they are both electron acceptors. So if you're losing a hydrogen, you're going to be losing an electron, which means that it's going to combine. It's going to be more ionic compound. That's what we learned in chemistry. Step 5, 4-carbon compound formed in step 4 releases a H atom to regenerate the oxaloacetic or acetic acid, which keeps Krebs cycle going. So step 5 just starts it all over again. And then of course it reduces, and the result is that for every glucose molecule causes 2 turns of your Krebs cycle to create 6 NADH, 2 FADH, 2 ATP, and then 4 CO2 molecules. So after that, bulk energy still hasn't been released from the glucose molecule and transferred to ATP. Most of the energy is extracted from the next process, the electron transport chain. So ETC is an aerobic respiration. It takes place on the inner membrane of your mitochondria. So ATP is produced by the chain. Electrons pass along the molecule to molecules, losing energy as they go. So electron transport chain. So chain, just like a chain link. So energy they lose is used to pump the hydrogen atoms across the membrane. Then the ATP from chemiomosis, sorry about that one, by going through ATP synthase. So the role of oxygen in this is to accept electrons at the end of an electron transport chain. This means that it will create water based on the acceptance of these hydrogen atoms. So with oxygen, without the oxygen, electrons would build upon the last molecule of the electron transport chain. The chain would come to a stop. Because of the oxygen, it accepts the electrons and allows the chain to continue. So of course, it's accepting these H electrons, which are your hydrogen atoms, and it is creating water. So you'll see gains 4 electrons of H4, of H plus, sorry, and then you have H2O. That is your yield. So through this aerobic respiration, most eukaryotic cells produce about 38 ATP molecules. So that makes it about 20 times better than Krebs cycle, and way more efficient than glycolysis alone. Cellular respiration can be summarized as this. So you take your glucose, you take your oxygen, and you convert that into CO2 energy burned off and water. So by having aerobic respiration, it creates all the energy the cell needs to survive and to function. All right, so aerobic respiration is about 66% efficient compared to a car, which is only about 25% efficient. So that's pretty good. We burn energy way better than what our cars do. That's why there's so much byproduct, so much carbon in the atmosphere. All right, so once you finish this, you need to do your quiz. Remember, 7 out of 10. You can go on to the next thing. The next thing will be your test. Your test is 50 questions. In order to move on to chapter 6 or section 6, whatever you want to call it, you must get a 35 out of 50. Okay? Once you have finished that, move on to section 6, and we are on the second half of biology. Good luck. Enjoy. Talk to you later. Use your notes. It's a good idea.